Welcome to the public scoping meeting for the development of post-2026 operational guidelines for Lake Powell and Lake Mead. My name is Amanda Erath, and I am the post-2026 program coordinator. This is the last of 3 public scoping meetings. You can join this meeting via Zoom or by calling in using the phone numbers provided on the next slide. If you need technical assistance during the meeting, please contact Jessica Sams at jessica.sams@swca.com. Now I'll turn it over to Meg Perry, who will go over some logistics for today's meeting.
Thank you, Amanda, and welcome everyone. Before we go any further, I just want to make sure everyone is aware that we do have live Spanish interpretation available throughout today's meeting. So I'll explain how to connect to that option. If you're interested in listening to today's meeting in Spanish, look for a little globe icon in your Zoom controls that's labeled interpretation. If you click on that icon, you should see Spanish as one of the options to select, and you'll be able to hear the entire meeting interpreted into Spanish. If you're listening in English, you will not need to click anything. You should be able to just stay right where you are and hear everything normally. If you have any trouble trying to connect to that Spanish audio or are not seeing the globe icon, just send us a question in the Q&A by clicking on the Q&A button here in Zoom to let us know. So I'll pause now and have our interpreters explain those instructions in Spanish.
Hola a todos y bienvenidos a la tercera reunión de consulta pública para el desarrollo de las directrices operativas para los lagos Powell y Mead post-2026. Esta es la última de 3 reuniones de consulta pública. Ustedes pueden unirse a esta reunión a través de Zoom o al llamar usando los números telefónicos dados en la parte inferior de la diapositiva anterior. Si ustedes necesitan asistencia técnica durante la reunión, por favor, pónganse en contacto con Jessica Sams escribiendo a jessica.sams@swca.com. Ahora les vamos a explicar cómo acceder al canal de interpretación al español si quieren escuchar la reunión en español. Nada más busquen en los controles de Zoom un icono de un globo con la etiqueta de interpretation o interpretación. Cuando hagan clic allí, van a ver una lista de idiomas, entre ellos español o Spanish. Hagan clic en Spanish y así pueden escuchar toda la reunión en español. Gracias.
Thank you very much. Just give a moment for anyone who's selecting the Spanish option to do that. All right, so just a bit of an orientation to what's coming up during the meeting today. We'll start with some introductory remarks and welcome from the Bureau of Reclamation, then hear a brief presentation from the team, and that will be followed by a period for public comments. And we'll explain at that point how you can let us know that you have a comment you'd like to share, and then some brief closing remarks. We will be taking questions throughout the meeting. And I'll explain that in just a moment. So to orient you to this Zoom webinar format that you're currently experiencing, as you probably saw when you signed in, the webinar is being recorded. Microphones are automatically muted as we do have a large number of attendees joining us today. Your chat feature is turned off, again, due to the large number of attendees, but do watch that chat as we'll use it to send you some links that we reference throughout the presentation. And then, as I mentioned, you can submit questions through the Q&A, and that's the Q&A tool that you see in your Zoom controls. So if you have a question at any point, you can click on that Q&A button. A box will pop up where you can type in your question, click send, and you'll see responses to questions that you've submitted appearing in that Q&A box. Again, we have a pretty large group, so we might not get to every single question, but the team is going to do their best to address as many as they can in the time we have today. And then, as I mentioned, during the second half of the meeting, we'll also be taking formal public comments for the record. And I'll explain when we get to that point how you can let us know that you have a comment to share. With that, I'm going to turn to our welcome from Bureau of Reclamation Commissioner Camille Clemlin-Tootin. If you're listening in Spanish today, this video may play very loudly over your Spanish interpretation, and you can silence it by clicking again on your globe icon and selecting mute main audio during this video so that you can hear the interpretation clearly. So with that, I'm just going to go ahead and pull up the video. Bear with me for a moment.
Hello, I'm Camille Clemlin-Tootin, Commissioner of the Bureau of Reclamation. I welcome you to this vital public meeting on the process to develop post-2026 operational guidelines and strategies for Lake Powell and Lake Mead. The new guidelines will replace the 2007 Colorado River interim guidelines for lower basin shortages and the coordinated operations for Lake Powell and Lake Mead, which are set to expire at the end of 2026. This is a vital conversation in determining alternatives to protect the stability and sustainability of the Colorado River. It is important that we hear your views on a way forward for all stakeholders to achieve our shared goals of long-term sustainability in this basin. Reclamation, the Department of the Interior, and the Biden-Harris administration are committed to an inclusive and transparent stakeholder process that encourages meaningful engagement. This is a monumentally important task that must be undertaken in a cooperative, collaborative spirit. This ensures a thorough, inclusive, and science-based decision-making process that builds a more sustainable future for the basin. This process builds on Reclamation's commitment to have the tools and strategies in place to help guide the next era of the Colorado River Basin, especially in the face of continued drought conditions. You are a vital part of that process, and I'm grateful that you're here today.
Next, I'll turn it to Carly Girlo with the Bureau of Reclamation to introduce the Reclamation team.
Good evening and welcome. My name is Carly Girla and I'm Reclamation's Program Manager for the Post-2026 program. We appreciate you taking the time this evening to participate in the meeting. And as the commissioner said, public engagement is a very important piece to this process, and you all are a critical part of that process. So it's both a pleasure and an honor to be with you here today. In hosting this meeting, I am joined by Amanda Erath, our post-2026 program coordinator who kicked off the meeting, and Russ Calejo, who is our post-2026 environmental compliance project manager. We are also joined by Reclamation leadership and experts in the Upper Colorado Basin and Lower Colorado Basin regions, all comprising the post-2026 team. At this point, if those Reclamation folks can turn on their cameras and say a quick hello. Great. Thanks everyone for being here today. So before receiving any scoping input or comments you may have, we would like to provide a brief presentation. I will begin with an overview of the project background, setting and need, and then we'll provide an overview of the key operational agreements that the post-2026 process will be developing the successor agreements to. I will then hand the presentation over to Amanda and Russ, who will describe the post-2026 process and scoping before any comments you'd like to provide today. And as Meg described earlier, if you have any questions along the way, please do put those in the question box and we'll try to respond to those as we're moving through the presentation. To start, I would like to set the stage by describing the operational setting for those who may not be familiar with the Colorado River Basin. So the basin spans a large portion of the western US. The Colorado River and its tributaries flow through 7 US states and then into northwestern Mexico, and provides essential water supplies to approximately 40 million people, nearly 5.5 million acres of agricultural lands and habitat for ecological resources through its journey from the headwaters of the Green River in Wyoming to the Gulf of California and Mexico. In the basin, 30 tribes consider the river and its tributaries an essential physical, economic, and cultural resource, and many of these tribes have substantial and often senior reserved water rights. Dams at the major reservoirs, which can store nearly 4 years of the basin's long-term average inflow, provide essential storage for municipal and agricultural needs, provide a multitude of recreational opportunities, and generate 4,200 megawatts of hydropower that feed the Western power grids. Over 90% of the system storage capacity resides in Lake Powell, formed by Glen Canyon Dam, and Lake Mead, formed by Hoover Dam. The operation of the system is governed by a complex body of legal agreements, including federal legislation, contracts, court decisions, and an international treaty with Mexico. Several of the operating agreements adopted in the last 15 years that govern the operation of Lakes Powell and Mead expire at the end of 2026, and that is why we are here this evening. These are the Colorado River Interim Guidelines for Lower Basin Shortages and Coordinated Operations for Lake Powell and Lake Mead, or we refer to those shorthand as the 2007 Interim Guidelines or the Guidelines, and the Colorado River Basin Drought Contingency Plans, or the DCPs. This figure is plotting the natural flow into the basin for over the last 100 years. And by natural flow, we mean the flow that would have arrived in the basin absent human impacts, such as consumptive use or reservoir regulation. And what this shows is a highly variable system with a difference of nearly 20 million acre feet between the lowest year on record, which is 1977, and the highest year on record, which was 1984. When the interim guidelines were being developed, the basin's long-term average inflow was about 14.9 million acre feet. The impetus for the development of the guidelines was the low flows in the early 2000s. From 2000 to 2004 marked the lowest 5-year average on record, and we'll revisit the significance of that in a moment. When the 2007 interim guidelines were being developed, the basin's long-term average inflow was 14.9 million acre feet. And since 2000, the basin has experienced a significant departure from that long-term average, with the most recent 24-year period averaging 16% less. And this decline is due to increasing basin temperatures and related hydrologic effects, resulting in drier conditions throughout the basin. So to recap, that long-term average leading up to the development of the guidelines was 14.9 million acre feet, but the most recent approximate 20-year average has been about 12.5 million acre feet. So while it's impossible to predict the future or know exactly what to plan for in post-2026, climate science tells us that the future temperatures in the basin will continue to warm and that we can expect an increased likelihood of experiencing prolonged droughts. This figure is plotting Lake Powell in the darker blue on top and Lake Mead in the lighter blue on the bottom. Storage and percent capacity since the two reservoirs' initial filling. This precipitous drop in storage over that 5-year period from 2000 to 2004, that lowest 5-year period on record, is what motivated the development of the guidelines. The average inflow during this period ranged from about 25 to 60% of average. System storage in the basin declined from nearly full to less than half capacity. By spring of 2005, Lake Powell was only at about 33% capacity, by far the lowest it had been since its original filling in the mid 1960s. And as a result, Secretary of the Interior Gail Norton at the time challenged the basin states and Reclamation to develop a drought mitigation plan and to implement this plan by 2007. And that became the 2007 interim guidelines developed through the 2007 NEPA process. Since that time, the system has not recovered to those levels prior and has generally declined as a result of dry hydrology coupled with basin water use. Currently, the combined storage of Powell and Meade is at about 36% capacity or 36% full. And this is an improvement from this time last year, which we were at about 27%. So it's an improvement, but is nonetheless low and not a comfortable percentage to be sitting at. Since the first year of operation under the guidelines in 2008, several new agreements and drought response actions have been implemented alongside other initiatives such as planning studies not listed here in response to the changing hydrologic conditions in the basin. The adoption of the guidelines for an interim period through 2026 has provided an opportunity to gain valuable operational experience, and that operational experience is an important consideration when thinking about future long-term operations. So along the top of the diagram, we can see the agreements that expire in 2026, and those are in orange, and alongside are the two ongoing processes in blue at the end of the diagram to modify Lake Powell and Lake Meade operations in both the near term and the long term. So here's a simple table comparing those two processes, the long-term and the near-term planning processes for the Colorado River system. The scopes and the durations of each are different. For near-term operations, the scope of that effort is limited to specific sections of the guidelines. The goal of that effort is to develop operational tools needed to address extreme drought and low water levels. And these are being developed through a separate NEPA process, the development of a supplemental EIS or an SEIS. It's a supplement to the original 2007 EIS for the guidelines. And this was initiated in November of last year. And the operational modifications that would come out of this process would be in place through 2026. So from 2024 through 2026. In contrast, the post-2026 process is focused on the long-term operations. And in this, we will need to revisit all sections of the 2007 interim guidelines, as well as other operating agreements that are set to expire in 2026, such as the DCP. And this public scoping process will help to determine the scope of that effort, including the duration of those operations. So in our notice of intent, we state that we are interested in receiving specific input on how the purpose and elements of the guidelines should be retained, modified, or eliminated to provide greater stability to water users and the public throughout the basin. So summarized from the 2007 record of decision, the purpose of the guidelines is to improve management of the Colorado River by considering trade-offs between the frequency and magnitude of reductions for water deliveries, provide a greater degree of predictability with respect to the amount of annual deliveries in future years, and this is primarily focused on the lower division states, and provide additional mechanisms for the storage and delivery of water supplies in Lake Meade to increase the flexibility of meeting water use needs from Lake Meade. The guidelines are then comprised of 4 elements that were designed to meet this purpose, and those are the shortage guidelines. So these provide prescribed volumes of lower basin shortages at specific Lake Meade elevations. Guidelines for coordinated reservoir operations, so that determine how to coordinate the operations between Lake Powell and Lake Meade. a storage and delivery of conserved water mechanism to provide for the delivery of conserved water from Lake Mead. And then a set of surplus guidelines that identify when the lower basin would be in surplus conditions and how water delivery should be made during those conditions. We call this diagram our operational diagram. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on every aspect of this diagram, but the key takeaway here is that the structure of the guidelines is reflected through this operational diagram. So those key elements are reflected through these operations. Powell is on the left side, Mead is on the right, and at both reservoirs, there are elevation bands or tiers that contain the guidelines for annual releases if the reservoir is within that tier. At Powell, there are either fixed volume or balancing releases or equalization releases at the higher tier, which means those releases are made in consideration of where Lake Mead is. And at Lake Mead, releases are adjusted based on the condition that the secretary determines that the lower basin is in, whether it's shortage, normal, or surplus conditions. In 2019, in response to changing hydrologic conditions and the increased risk of reaching critically low elevations at Powell and Mead, the Colorado River Basin DCPs were adopted. And these plans acted as an overlay to the 2007 guidelines. They are essentially a combined set of operational guidelines and also expire in 2026. And those key elements are a requirement of additional water savings contributions by the lower basin states, additional flexibility for water storage and recovery to incentivize conservation, a drought response operations and demand management in the upper basin. And this also triggered Mexico's binational water scarcity contingency plan, which was an element of Minute 323 with the 1944 treaty with Mexico. In 2020, per a requirement from the 2007 Record of Decision, we conducted a formal review of the guidelines, evaluating their effectiveness and documenting our operational experience. The review concluded that the guidelines were not sufficiently robust and that additional actions were needed to reduce risk, and offered several considerations as to how to enhance effectiveness. Those considerations are enhanced flexibility and transparency for water users, expanded participation in conservation and basin-wide programs, and an increased consideration of the linkage that occurs between the two basins from coordinated reservoir operations, and that more robust measures are needed to protect reservoir elevations. I will now pass the presentation over to Amanda to describe the post-2026 process. I hope I have provided some useful background information and context that is also included in the notice of intent to inform and frame your scoping comments. Thank you.
Thanks, Carly. So as Carly discussed, several of the operating agreements that govern the operation of Lake Powell and Lake Mead expire at the end of 2026. Through the post-2026 process, we will develop successor domestic agreements for the long-term operations and management of the Colorado River system beginning in 2027. The post-2026 process will be a multi-year NEPA process, which will be concluded in mid-2026 before the development of the 2027 annual operating plan for Colorado River reservoirs begins. This process is focused on domestic actions. There is a parallel process through the International Boundary and Water Commission to develop successor agreements to Minute 323 with Mexico, which Carly discussed. While we are now in the scoping phase of the post-2026 process, which Russ is going to talk a little more about in a few minutes here. Reclamation also solicited pre-scoping input by publishing a Federal Register notice in June of 2022. This Federal Register notice requested input on the process and substantive elements for the post-2026 process. It also highlighted 3 changed circumstances in the basin since 2007. First, the changed hydrologic conditions that have resulted in unprecedented drought and historically low reservoir conditions. Second, the desire for full engagement and consultation of the Basin tribes and Reclamation's commitment to engage with the Basin tribes in a meaningful and transparent manner during the post-2026 process. And lastly, the extraordinary cooperative process that has been forged between the US and Mexico since 2007 to develop and implement several significant international agreements on the Colorado River. In response to the Federal Register notice, Reclamation received 56 stakeholder letters signed by 82 unique stakeholders, including 11 tribes and 141 unique comment letters from concerned citizens. The input that we received was summarized in the pre-scoping summary report, which was published in January of 2023 and is now available on Reclamation's post-2026 website. Some of the key themes that we found in the pre-scoping comments after reviewing them, we identified 3 main key themes. First, future operational guidelines must be robust and adaptive. They must support proactive management to improve system stability and be capable of both withstanding a broad range of future hydrologic and operating conditions and minimizing system vulnerability. Second, future operational guidelines should recognize a holistic approach. They should focus on the long-term sustainability of both the basin's population and its natural environment, minimize system vulnerability, and increase system resiliency. Thirdly, future operational guidelines should consider alternative paradigms for operation of the system beyond a tiered approach to coordinated operation of Lake Powell and Lake Mead, which Carly discussed earlier in that operational diagram. Reclamation is currently working to design and implement a stakeholder engagement process that is inclusive and transparent, that encourages meaningful input from tribes, states, partners, stakeholders, as well as the public. We are working to implement this commitment through prioritizing stakeholder technical education and technical outreach, creating a common technical understanding and developing new tools for engagement in the process, and prioritizing outreach by leveraging existing groups and creating new groups with the goal of enhanced tribal engagement across the basin. We will provide more specific information on the engagement structure and opportunities for engagement in the process as we move forward. Last thing I'm going to talk about is the schedule for the post-2026 process. So on the left side of this figure on this slide, you can see where we are now in the process. We published the Notice of Intent, or NOI, last month and are now in the scoping period. Scoping comments are due August 15th, 2023. We will then develop and release a scoping summary report summarizing the comments that we receive and identifying the anticipated purpose and need for the NEPA process. Then in the fall of 2023, the alternatives development phase of the process will begin, and that will go through the spring of 2024. Reclamation will then work to prepare the draft environmental impact statement, or EIS, from the spring of 2024 through the fall of 2024. And we anticipate publishing the draft EIS in December of 2024. And there will then be a public comment period that will follow that publication. We will then spend most of 2025 and the beginning of 2026 developing the final EIS and the record of decision. And as I mentioned earlier, we intend to have the new guidelines finalized by the middle of 2026, prior to the beginning of the development of the 2027 annual operating plan. With that, I will turn it over to Russ to talk a little more about the scoping process.
Thanks, Amanda. I'm Russ Calejo, Project Manager for Post 2026 Environmental Compliance. I'd like to offer my welcome as well and provide just a few more details about the scoping process. First, here's a general overview slide. All these items have been mentioned previously. This slide provides key scoping information in one place. So first, the notice of intent was published on June 16th. It initiated the NEPA scoping process. 60-day public comment period ends on August 15th. We invite all Basin partners, stakeholders, and interested members of the public to provide oral and written comments. And finally, a scoping report will be published after the comment period sometime this fall. I anticipate that in September. One thing to mention on that 60-day public scoping period, it's longer than typical. Typically, it's 30 to 45 days. We did that here, recognizing the importance and complexity of this process. We went for 60 days. Next is a roadmap for effective participation in the scoping process. This slide helps to inform and frame your comments. It's organized into 3 columns or blocks that are outlined in different colors. The first on the left is considerations. It's outlined in dark blue. It's background information to consider when developing your comments. And that's the past 15 years of operating experience, findings from the 2020 review of the 2007 interim guidelines, themes in the pre-scoping report, and the need for robust and adaptive operations. Next, that middle box, highlighted in light blue, that's the particular information that Reclamation is seeking input on. Now, we'll accept all comments and input. However, this box identifies a particular input, and that is feedback on operational guidelines and strategies, potential modifications to the purpose and elements of the 2007 interim guidelines, and any other related issues that should be considered in the EIS. And finally, the last box outlined in yellow, that's how your comments will be used, what it will inform. And so that's the following. It'll help inform the proposed federal action, the purpose and need for that action, and the scope of the analysis. For example, the affected area, the geographic scope, and the time horizon or term of the document. Lots of good information has been presented today so far. If you take one thing home today, I would recommend focusing on this slide. Here are the 5 ways to comment, and I'm going to read each one in detail for the convenience of folks that are joining by phone. So first, here are the public scoping meetings. We'll have time for comments at the end, verbally. Next, we have a web form that's on the project website, and here's that website, www.usbr.gov/Colorado River Basin /post 2026. Next, you can send an email, and our email address is crb post2026@usbr.gov. We also have a telephone hotline, that number 602-789-3889. And finally, the old-fashioned way, mail to the Bureau of Reclamation. And that address is Attention Post 2026, Mail Stop 84-55000, PO Box 25007, Denver, Colorado 80225. And in the top right, I just want to draw your attention one more time to the red letters up there. The red 60-day public comment period closes on August 15th. All right, this last slide summarizes, locations where you can get additional information. I've given the website and the hotline and where to send questions to already. I won't repeat that, but this is a helpful slide to have the location of information in one spot. And this presentation is posted already to our website. And we're going to put a link in the chat if it's not there already. And I will now turn the presentation back over to Meg to start the public comment session. Thank you.
Great, thanks Russ, thanks Carly and Amanda. And thanks to you all for your attention thus far. As Russ mentioned, these are options for addressing any questions that we might not get to today, but we continue to take any questions you might have in that Q&A tool here in Zoom. So questions came up based on the presentation you just saw. The team is standing by to help provide what responses they can. So go ahead and click that Q&A button and send any questions you have. These are not formally for the public record, but they hopefully will help you to provide more informed comments. So that's really the intention for those questions today. With that, we're going to go into the formal public comment portion of the meeting. So I'll just give you a little bit of information about how that's going to work. So first, a few guidelines. First of all, we ask that you please do direct your comments to the Bureau of Reclamation team rather than to other commenters. They are here to listen and, as Russ went over, take in your input into the next phases of the process. We'll be limiting comments to 3 minutes, so we have time to hear from as many commenters as possible. If you have more than 3 minutes worth of comments, we do encourage you to submit those in writing. Certainly welcome longer comments via those other methods. And finally, probably goes without saying, but this virtual event is designed to be viewed in homes across the country in real time. We never know what little ears might be in the room listening, so we ask you to please refrain from any profanity. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and open things up. If you have a comment to share today with the team, you can click the raise hand button in Zoom, or if you're listening on the phone, press *9 on your keypad to raise your hand. I will do my best to pronounce your name and call on you. And then please do click unmute or *6 on your phone keypad to unmute. We'll ask that you state and spell your name for the record when you begin your comment, and then you'll have 3 minutes with this comment timer on the screen, or if you're on the phone, I'll chime in around 1 minute to go to let you know how you're doing for time. So with that, we're opening it up. The team is standing by to hear your comments on this scoping process. And all you need to do is click the raise hand button in Zoom or *9 on your keypad to let us know that you have a comment to share. You know, we threw a lot of information at you pretty fast for a Monday evening, so I understand folks might need a minute to think about what questions you have or whether you have a comment to share. All right, I'm seeing a hand up from David Wegner. Gonna allow you to unmute. Are you there?
Yeah, I had to find the right key here to unmute. I think this question's for Russ in particular. There are a number of environmental programs, endangered fish programs, water quality programs that are already in existence in the Colorado River system. How do you see those being integrated into the overall process? Thank you.
Thanks. And just to clarify, we are taking comments right now. So That's a great consideration for the team to be thinking about. If you're looking for an immediate answer, if you could type that into the Q&A, that will allow the team to review it together and provide a response during today's meeting. But we've certainly noted that comment for the record. All right, next it looks like we have initials DK. So if you could just share your name when we unmute.
Sincere apologies. I did not mean to indicate that I had a question, but I do, since I have the floor, want to mention, really appreciate the ability to have this online forum and all the work that Reclamation is doing and the team here. So appreciations and apologies for a false alarm.
All right, thanks. All right, that's all the hands I'm seeing at the moment, but certainly the floor is open. So go ahead and click on that raise hand button in Zoom if you have a comment to share. Or if you have a question and you're hoping for a response during the meeting today, you can type on the Q&A, click on the Q&A button, looks like two little talk bubbles, and type in your question there, and the team will be working to respond to questions as they come in. All right, not seeing any hands up at the moment. I'll just share a reminder of some of the things Russ went through, which I've dropped in the chat. So if you do click on that chat box there in Zoom, you can see all the information about how to submit comments and copy and paste that for your future reference, as well as the link to where the slides from the presentation are posted. And it looks like we have another commenter. Sarah Matz.
Yes, hi. Okay, yes, hi, my name is Sarah Matz. I am here in Arizona. And I'm not sure if this is the right place to address this question, but I'm just going to go for it. I know that here in Arizona, we have been alerted that I think it's called a tier 1 water shortage alert. And my question is, do you think that we are headed for the next phase in that, like the next level of water shortage alert at the pace that we're going?
Thanks, Sarah. And again, we're taking questions for immediate response in that Q&A tool. So if you're looking for a response right now, if you can click on the Q&A and type in your question, that'll allow the team to review it. Otherwise, that question you just shared will be noted as a comment for the record, and the team will be considering it along with other comments as they move forward. Thanks. We do have a few questions coming in, so even if you don't have a question, if you are looking at that Q&A box, you'll see as answers start to be shared, they'll show up there for you. And I'm just going to take us back to that slide that Russ highlighted, which gives some guidance about the kinds of things that the team is hoping you might be able to comment on either today or later between now and August 15th in writing. All right, looks like we have John Rickenbach. You have a comment to share?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes, go
Okay.
ahead.
I plan to submit a written comment, but just as a first thought here, in developing alternatives for study, I want to clarify first for myself, and maybe this is a question, first of all, that we're providing comments both on the short-term operations, NEPA compliance, and the long-term EIS that will likely come out to deal with the post-2026. That's a question. But the comment in terms of the short term, anyway, probably the long term as well, is if there are modifications to operations related to releases from Glen Canyon Dam, or for that matter, Hoover Dam, that there be greater flexibility than what was shown in the scoping meeting from earlier, or the preliminary alternatives that were developed before the process was put on hold pending the 7 states agreement, where I think it showed as a minimum of 6 million acre feet could be released in any given year, as opposed to the current, I think something like 7, depending on the situation. I don't see the reason why you couldn't consider a more open-ended, flexible down to 5, say, to account for certain situations that might not otherwise be covered. For example, right now, there were extraordinary circumstances in the last couple of years that may have dictated an even lesser release than was actually the case in 2021 and 2022. And maybe this year, with things being up such as they were, a little more flexibility in the guidelines for releases as well. And then the other comment would be, I know this is in the short term, we're really just talking about changes to use in the lower basin states, but I do think the long-term solution really involves all 7 states and Mexico, and some sort of proportional cutbacks that affect all of them. And I think in the short term, you can only do what you can do, considering you only have control over the lower basin uses. But I think the long-term big picture really has to involve all 7 states cooperating to get lower than they currently are today. And that'll be my comment directed at the long-term operation question. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And just for anyone else who might be wondering about that distinction between the near term and the long term processes, which are both going on, today's meeting is really focused on scoping for the long term effort. So understand that there's some related thoughts that might be connected to both processes as they are related. Today's meeting is really focused on scoping for that long term post 2026 effort. All right, continuing to welcome other comments through the remainder of our meeting time. And at least one question that's received an answer there in the Q&A. So if you are curious about what other people might be asking, you can click on that Q&A button and start to see some answers coming through. Looks like Sandra Leonard has a comment to share. Are you there?
Sorry, just accidentally clicked the wrong button. Thank you.
Okay, no worries. Thank you. And I should have mentioned before, we do have our interpreters available if anyone is listening in Spanish and has a comment to share. You can certainly deliver your comment in Spanish and we will be able to interpret it live for the team to hear what you're sharing in English. So that's an option, of course. And you can also submit questions in writing in Spanish. And likewise, we'll be able to translate those for the team. So certainly welcome any questions or comments in Spanish as well. All right, I'm not seeing any other hands up at the moment. We're going to continue to stand by. If anyone else has a comment to share, go ahead and click that raise hand button or press *9 on your phone. But we'll just do a quick reminder of the ways to comment besides the meeting today. So as Russ mentioned, in addition to today's meeting, you have the option to submit a comment in writing on the project website. Send it via email to that CRB post2026@usbr.gov address. You can also leave a voicemail at the telephone hotline 602-789-3889, or send via mail to Bureau of Reclamation, attention post-2026, mail stop 84-55,000, PO Box 25007, Denver, Colorado 80225. So those are all options between now and August 15th to get your comments in to Reclamation, and again, help with them thinking about those things that Russ mentioned on the slide for consideration. All right, we're going to continue standing by until the top of the hour as scheduled. So if you do think of a comment or decide you have something to share, go ahead and raise your hand and we'll see you and come on to hear your comment. But otherwise, the team is working on some responses to questions, and you'll see those populate in the Q&A as they finalize them. Looks like we have another person that wants to share a comment. Mr. Kuntz, are you there?
Hi, yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation today. It has been really helpful. I have a brief comment regarding alternatives that should be analyzed in the draft EIS. And wanted to note that looking at alternatives where either Lake Powell or Lake Mead should be decommissioned, and then focusing on either filling one of those reservoirs. It's not necessarily a great idea, but it should be analyzed in full in the draft EIS. And then as somewhat of a separate comment, just want to encourage the Bureau to really work with the USGS and to really use all of the important research that the USGS has done, particularly in the Grand Canyon, regarding the recreation economy, sediment transport, and a number of other factors. But yes, I'll leave it at that and looking forward to submitting written comments.
Great. Thank you so much. All right, we do have just a few minutes left in our meeting time, so last call for any comments. Go ahead and raise your hand or press *9 on your phone. And once again, if you didn't get your question answered today, or if you think of something after today's meeting, these are some options for following up with the team to get additional information or ask any questions you might have. All right, not seeing any other hands. I'm going to turn it to you, Carly, to offer some closing remarks here as we're getting close to the end.
Okay, thank you, Meg. And thanks to everyone out there for carving time out of your evening to join us here. We've really appreciated the comments and the questions and look forward to your continued engagement throughout this process. So have a nice evening. Thank you.
Great, thanks. And I'll just put up that how to comment slide one more time for anyone who might need that information. And again, that's in the chat as well for you to copy and paste for your reference. Thanks so much for your attention and participation in this process today. And we do have a few more answers to questions that have been posted in the Q&A. So go ahead and take a look there if you're looking for responses to your question or curious to see what others may have asked. Right, we are at 7 p.m. Want to say thanks once more for everyone's attention and participation today. Thanks for all the comments and thoughtful questions. Again, if you didn't get your question answered today, there's those other avenues via the website or the project email to reach out to the team. And we hope to see comments from many of you between now and August 15th. Thanks everyone so much. With that, we are adjourned.